Welcome to A Powerless Mage Presents. This is the place where we take these really complex, sometimes decades or even centuries-long ideas, and we try to distill them down into something you can actually use. Actionable knowledge.
We're basically trying to give you the blueprint, for what's happening just under the surface of modern life.
And I think this dive is, well, it's particularly relevant for so many people right now. We're going to be talking about pressures and expectations.
Exactly. Those invisible forces that kind of dictate how we feel, how we act, how we lead our lives. And this really isn't an academic exercise.
No, not at all.
It's more like a personal roadmap to maybe a little more freedom.
That's a great way to put it. Our mission today is very, very focused. We want you to understand, deeply and structurally, why certain social pressures can feel so overwhelming.
Especially around expectations of manhood and gender roles in general.
Yeah. We're going to analyze the historical and social conditioning that has created what we now, popularly call toxic masculinity.
And our source for this is a really powerful reflective essay. It's one of those pieces that connects the dots between history, biology, sociology, all to explain this phenomenon that's been unfolding for millennia.
And we're just testing these ideas, right? We're trying to seek some truth here, understand the cause.
And hopefully illuminate a path toward, healthier living for everyone.
I really want to be crystal clear with you on this one point. Our objective here is absolutely not to excuse or to exempt any harmful behavior. Not at all.
No, that's a critical distinction.
It's to illuminate the root cause.
Yeah.
Because only then can we actually stop perpetuating the problem. So if you've ever felt trapped by these expectations of, having to be strong all the time or silent or always in command, this deep dive is for you.
We're going to keep it clear. No jargon. This is about practical understanding.
We want you to walk away feeling equipped to maybe choose a different path.
Because when you understand the architecture of the cage, you can start building the tools to escape it. And that knowledge, that's real power.
So today, we are going to trace this masculine stigma all the way back. Back to before Homo sapiens even existed. We're going to chart a journey from simple biological instinct all the way to rigid social law.
And then we're going to tackle something really surprising, a very common concept that is so often misunderstood. Chivalry.
It's time to really, truly unpack all of this history. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The real beginning. The source demands that we don't start with society or culture.
Right. We have to start with biology, with our animal nature.
The precognitive blueprint.
Exactly. The roots of these gender roles. They weren't originally social norms dictated by, priests or kings. Not at all. They were biological tendencies that developed purely for survival in these really primitive species.
We're talking about a time before modern humans even.
Way before. And if we trace it back, certain, let's call them trends, they influenced how tasks were distributed in a group.
And we're talking about primitive differences here. Though I think it's important to stress the source is really careful to note that individual variability was always a huge factor.
Oh, absolutely. It was never a case of, all males are this way, all females are that way. It was about general tendencies, averages, really.
So what were those general tendencies?
Well, across these early human species, males generally tended to have greater muscle mass, more upper body strength.
Which translates to what? Short bursts of intense power.
Exactly. The kind of power you need for, say, hunting very large game, or for direct physical defense of the tribe against a predator or another group.
Okay, so that's one side. What about the other?
On the other hand, females generally exhibited a greater resistance to pain and also more acute sensory perception.
That second part is fascinating. We always hear about the muscle mass difference, but pain resistance and sharper senses, that's often overlooked.
It is, and it's a huge piece of the puzzle. It's not just that men were built for fighting. Women were, in a way, built for endurance and a different kind of high-stakes vigilance.
Endurance for what, specifically?
Well, think about it. The incredible physical endurance needed for gestation, for childbirth, and then the sustained vigilance required to protect resources, to manage the community's core, to watch over the young.
And the acute sensory perception. That would help in identifying subtle threats, maybe, or finding resources.
Precisely. Identifying which plants are safe, noticing a predator before it gets too close, it's a different kind of strength. Not explosive power, but sustained long-term resilience and awareness.
So you have these two different kinds of physical strengths being honed by evolution.
Yes. And here is the most important point of this entire part of the discussion. These biological differences, They influenced the distribution of certain group tasks. They absolutely did not determine them.
That distinction feels critical.
It's the whole ball game. These differences created a sort of a default pathway for specialization. If you need to lift something incredibly heavy for a short time, you'd probably send the person with the most muscle mass. It's just pragmatic.
But that wasn't a rigid rule.
Not at all. If a particular woman in the group had greater mass, she would take the heavy task. This was purely about what worked for the group's survival in that moment. It was a starting point for function, not a social law.
But then, something changed. We hit this defining moment in human history, the cognitive revolution. This is where everything shifts from just instinct to idea.
Right. And here we're drawing on these foundational ideas from historians like Yuval Noah Harari. The cognitive revolution is that moment, that sudden explosion where our species gained the ability to communicate complex, abstract ideas.
So before this, we could maybe signal danger, lion.
Yeah, a concrete, immediate warning. But after this revolution, we could suddenly communicate things like honor your fallen comrade, or the spirit of the mountain is angry and demands a sacrifice.
That is a huge leap, an absolutely massive jump.
It changed everything. Suddenly we had these new social tools. We had stories, values, laws. We could convey these incredibly sophisticated concepts.
We started developing spiritual practices, inventing systems of judgment.
And we gained the ability to grow as a species by building these complex civilizations based on shared myths and ideas.
But this new capacity must have caused some kind of friction, right?
Immense friction. It created what the source calls the forced reconciliation. We had to somehow reconcile our ancient, practical animal instincts with these brand new, complex, abstract ideas and social structures.
Let's spend a moment on that. Give me an example of this forced reconciliation in action. What does that actually look like?
Okay, so consider the instinct to flee from danger. In a purely animalistic sense, if a saber-toothed cat attacks, your body floods with adrenaline and your instinct is to run. It's pure survival.
Makes sense.
But with the cognitive revolution, we introduce an abstract concept, an idea, something like courage or duty to the tribe.
Ah, okay.
Now, that powerful, useful instinct to run for your life has to be actively suppressed. It has to be pushed down in favor of the abstract idea of standing your ground to defend the others in your group.
So, masculinity, in this early sense, becomes defined by the suppression of functional animal instincts like fear, or showing pain in favor of these new, abstract cultural ideal.
It's exactly duty, strength, honor. And that, right there, is the origin point of the emotional repression we still see traces of today.
Wow. And this reconciliation, this friction, this is the birthplace of all major social authority systems, right? Patriarchal, matriarchal, all of them.
Yes. It didn't matter if the ultimate figurehead was male or female. The underlying division of tasks, now reinforced by ideas and values, still had to be addressed and managed.
And this is where we see the birth of the protector role. The source calls this a transcendent role, one that largely defined male social identity no matter what the culture's leadership structure looked like.
In general, men took on the responsibility of defending the community. The source is careful to note the important exceptions, like the Amazons, who obviously challenged this norm.
But they were the exception, not the rule.
For the vast majority of human cultures, yes. The physical defense of the settlement, hunting large, dangerous animals, and engaging in warfare. These became the defining male tasks.
And this role, this job description, it was the catalyst for everything that followed. The responsibility of being the defender led to the refinement, the source even says the perfection, of attributes that still define our modern, often very rigid, concept of manhood.
This is so critical for understanding the stigma we live with today. These weren't just random characteristics someone made up. They were seen as necessary virtues, refined and hardened by the constant threat of extinction.
Let's break down the three main ones the source identifies. First up, strength and endurance.
Obvious but foundational. These were the decisive factors for physical victory against any threat. If you lose the fight, the whole community dies. So maximizing your physical capacity wasn't just a personal goal.
It was a moral and social imperative.
Absolutely. If you were physically weak or lazy, you weren't just failing yourself, you were failing everyone. You were a danger to the group.
So the modern pressure to, hit the gym or work hard, its deepest root is right here. A necessary virtue that over millennia became an unwavering, almost unconscious demand.
Right. Okay, second attribute. And this is the one that arguably causes the most personal suffering today. Hiding emotions or weakness.
This goes beyond just being stoic, doesn't it?
Oh, much deeper. This was deeply tactical. The source attributes this to the very real fear of becoming easy prey. If you're the designated defender, showing pain or showing fear makes you a liability.
How so?
Well, an enemy, human or animal, could exploit your visible injury. They'd see you limping and know you're the weak link. A predator could be attracted by the scent or sound of your panic. So this tactical necessity, this suppression of what you might call emotional leakage, it was practiced relentlessly.
They perfected the art of not showing weakness.
They turned the human face into a neutral mask during a crisis.
And that mask, born in the age of the spear, it's the same one that men are still taught to wear today in a boardroom or during a difficult conversation with their partner.
The stakes are completely different, of course, but the conditioned response is identical. Showing weakness could equal death, or at least failure.
It's deeply ingrained. Okay, so what's the third attribute?
Rigidity of command.
That sounds like a recipe for a dictatorship.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing the source frames it as another tactical necessity.
It was. Imagine a sudden crisis, a raid on the village, a flash flood, a battle. Tactical strategy in that moment requires absolute intolerance of disobedience or questioning of authority.
There's no time for a debate.
Zero time. If the lead defender yells, "Retreat to the left," and someone stops to ask, "Are you sure that's the best way?" the whole group is vulnerable. The consequence of that debate could be everyone getting killed.
So this rigidity, which was only useful in a very specific, high-stakes, immediate crisis.
It became an ingrained concept of how men must lead and behave in any position of authority.
And that explains so much. Why so many modern leaders in business or politics struggle with collaboration or hearing dissent.
They're running a quarterly budget meeting as if they're commanding troops in a life-or-death battle. The legacy of that crisis mentality is incredibly powerful.
So these three traits, strength, rigidity, hiding emotion, they were survival tools. They made perfect logical sense in a primitive crisis.
But they became ingrained ideas. They became expectations that transcended the crisis itself and were embedded into the very definition of what it meant to be a man.
They became our cultural DNA.
And that DNA now conflicts dramatically, sometimes painfully, with the demands of the modern world, a world that requires empathy, flexibility, and emotional intelligence to succeed.
When you ask a man to be emotionally vulnerable today, you are, in a fundamental way, asking him to abandon a millennia-old, culturally enforced survival strategy.
And that realization is profound. It shifts the dynamic from just, "Why is he like this?" to something more like, "What is all this history forcing him to defend against?"
It gives you empathy for the struggle, without removing responsibility for the outcome. So before we move on, let's just pause for our first reflection. For you, the listener, think about your own life. Which of these ancient protector-based attributes, strength, rigidity, hiding emotion, do you feel society still demands of you today, even when you are nowhere near a crisis? Maybe it's that pressure to always seem confident or to never admit that you're lost, either physically or emotionally, that expectation. That's the direct residue of this deep history.
All right, so now we make a really important transition. We move from these ideas being born out of necessity to them becoming arbitrary social rules.
This is where the practical utility of that protector role starts to get lost, and the stigma becomes purely cultural.
Exactly. The source shows how, as time went on, those battle-forged ideas, they didn't just stay on the battlefield. They endured and were applied to every aspect of life.
Even parts of life that had nothing to do with combat or survival.
Right. It's the permeation of ideas. Think of it like a bureaucracy. A rule gets established for a very specific safety reason. Let's say you have to wear a hard hat in a construction zone. Makes sense. But decades later, someone decides that, well, to be safe, everyone should wear hard hats in the office too, even though there's zero risk of falling debris. The rule persists because the original logic protecting people has been generalized and made absolute, even when it's absurd.
So it's like the military operational manual becoming the manual for running a bakery?
That's a perfect analogy. It shifts from defining tasks to defining people. These rules were no longer about immediate survival. They were about maintaining a very specific social order, a hierarchy, based on this idea of the male as the protector and, by extension, the superior.
The source gives a really striking historical example of this, maritime exclusion.
Yes. For centuries, women were formally, legally forbidden to board or work on marine vessels, on ships.
And the reasons given for this, across different cultures and centuries, they're fascinating because they have nothing to do with, say, maritime physics or a woman's ability to sail.
No, they're all rooted in this developing masculine
See,
stigma.
what were some of these stigma-based reasons?
Well, the primary fear that comes up again and again was the fear of softening the crew. And this isn't about physical distraction,
It's not a sexual thing, then.
not primarily. It's a fear that the necessary rigidity and emotional armor required of a sailor who had to face extreme danger, isolation, death, that all of that would break down if a woman introduced qualities like emotional comfort or sensitivity into that environment.
So a woman's mere presence was seen as a threat to the man's required psychological state. The rigid, repressed solver identity was considered fragile.
Exactly. It wasn't a threat to the boat, it was a threat to the mindset. Other reasons included, distracting them with sexual temptations.
Which again implies that the male crew's focus is incredibly fragile and easily disrupted.
Yes. Or just the simple circular belief that the entire profession was exclusively male because it was dangerous, and danger must, by definition, be handled by the protector class.
And that's how a practical distinction, on average, men have more upper body strength, becomes a rigid social exclusion rule. Women cannot participate, period, regardless of their individual strength or skill.
The sea became a new, sacred male space, a floating battlefield where battle rules must apply at all times.
And that's how a practical role solidifies into an arbitrary social rule. If men are protectors and commanders, then their workspace has to reflect that rigidity, even if the only real threat on a long voyage is, boredom or scurvy, not pirates.
The idea becomes more important than the reality.
Okay, so now we get to what is probably one of the most controversial points in the source material, the ironic twist involving the misunderstood code of chivalry.
Right. As these ideas permeated society, they often did so with a tacit, unspoken agreement of women.
And this is the uncomfortable truth the source really forces us to confront. The concept of chivalry, this elaborate code of conduct, the preferential treatment given to women by men, was fundamentally based on one single premise.
And that premise is that women are inferior beings.
Okay, I have to push back a little here because in modern society, we've completely scrubbed that historical premise away. We see chivalry now as a sign of respect, of courtesy. Why insist on this inferiority premise?
Because the entire concept of protection requires a hierarchy. The preference, the special treatment, was granted because women were viewed as needing special handling, as needing the man's superior strength and judgment to navigate a harsh world.
So a man holding a door or offering his coat, you're saying it wasn't a recognition of equality?
The source argues it was the opposite. It was a demonstration of her perceived delicacy, her weakness. The fairer sex was seen as weaker, more fragile, and therefore requiring the constant oversight and strength of the superior male.
So it's conditional respect. It's respect based on a perceived deficit.
Precisely. And it reinforces the entire system. It reinforces the idea of male superiority and their mandatory role as protector, while at the same time defining the woman as someone perpetually in need of that protection.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle of the stigma. The man performs the chivalrous act, which reinforces his identity as the strong provider.
And the woman accepts the act, which reinforces her position as the one who needs providing for. Even if, consciously, they both reject the historical premise of inferiority, the behavior is still rooted in that ancient, unequal structure.
The source makes a really provocative point that many women who demand chivalry today are entirely unaware of this historical premise.
They're asking for a behavior that, at its root, reinforces the very patriarchy they might intellectually oppose.
It just goes to show how deeply ingrained and invisible these cultural clauses can become. They feel good. They feel traditional, polite, romantic even.
But they're carrying all this historical baggage that defines women as fragile and men as these emotionally armored saviors.
This leads us to a crucial point about who is responsible for this stigma. It wasn't exclusively imposed by men.
Not even close. The source is very clear that this conditioning came from both sides. This cultural agreement on these roles is what allowed them to persist for centuries.
If a woman felt safer, or maybe found a societal advantage in accepting the premise that she needed protection,
she reinforced the system just as much as the man who enforced it. It was a transaction.
can we give some specific, maybe even uncomfortable modern examples of this mutual reinforcement?
Sure. Think of a relationship where the man is expected to be solely responsible for all financial decisions, or all the physical labor around the house, even if his partner is equally capable or maybe even better suited to the task.
He takes on the burden of the provider-protector role.
And she, perhaps, happily accepts the exemption from that responsibility. They are mutually reinforcing that antiquated division of labor and, importantly, the emotional burden that comes with it.
Or what about a mother who teaches her son that he must open doors and pay for dates? not just because it's a nice gesture, but because that's what real gentlemen do.
And that phrase silently implies that women can't or shouldn't handle these things themselves. It's teaching the hierarchy all over again.
So the culture basically agreed on these clauses. Men get the authority and the emotional repression.
And women get the protection and the expectation of fragility. It's a bad deal for both genders in the modern world. It limits everyone.
So if we pull this whole section together, the stigma transformed from a genuine necessity for survival
Into a pervasive, often seemingly innocuous cultural clause, dictating arbitrary behavior and reinforcing a hierarchy that was no longer necessary.
It moved from survival strategy to, fighting the bear to social expectation, who pays for dinner.
And the incredible weight of that expectation is what we call the masculine stigma today.
Okay, time for our second reflexive question. Can you identify a common social expectation today? Maybe it's chivalry, or automatically assuming a man will fix a leaky faucet, or even refusing to let a man express his sadness. That seems polite or traditional on the surface, but might actually be rooted in an outdated idea of superiority or inferiority. Just for a moment, think about the underlying historical premise of that action. Okay, so we've established the ancient blueprint, and we've seen how it's spread through these cultural rules like chivalry. Now let's jump forward in time to the 20th century. This is the pivot point. This is where those ancient rules collide head-on with revolutionary new ideas.
And this collision creates the crisis of identity that we are still living in today. And it all begins with the rise of a single idea.
The rise of the unique human being.
It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But this was perhaps the most dangerous and destabilizing idea of the modern era. Starting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this idea that we now take for granted started to take hold, that each human being is unique and individual.
It's obvious to us now, but for millennia, your identity was collective. You were a hunter, a defender, a wife, a member of your tribe or your village. Your role was defined by the group.
And suddenly, that definition started breaking down. It created what the source calls the great dissonance.
A dissonance between what? The group and the self.
Exactly. This new idea of individuality immediately and fundamentally questioned the roles that had dictated behavior for generations. If my individual talents, my personality, my desires are different from my community's expectations for my gender, which identity takes precedence?
And this must have specifically challenged the core male model we've been talking about.
Tremendously. If the model demands strength and rigidity in command, what do you do with the men who are, by their nature, gentle or sensitive, or inclined toward art or nurturing rather than fighting?
Before this, they were probably just marginalized or ignored.
Quietly, yes. But now, concepts like the sensitive man or the effeminate man caused huge problems because they became highly visible public exceptions to the historical rule. In the context of individualism, they weren't just outliers. They were living proof that the rule itself, the very definition of man, was arbitrary and limiting.
So the pressure on the individual man must have intensified. He was still expected to live up to this ancient model, but his internal reality might completely contradict it.
And this created a massive internal crisis. At the same time, this movement toward questioning and breaking limitations was famously being led by women.
They provided the proof of capability that shook the entire system to its core.
Yes, the sources highlight how women demonstrated that physical differences were not social limitations. They took charge of farms, property, businesses, especially during wartime when the men were away.
They stepped into these so-called male roles: command, logistics, resource management, and they thrived.
They proved, beyond any doubt, that competency was not gendered. That old excuse that women were inherently incapable of leadership or financial oversight, it just vanished in the face of reality.
And this powerful demonstration of capability, it fueled the massive movement seeking true equality. The right to vote, equal employment, equal legal rights.
It directly challenged that deep-seated assumption of inferiority that we just discussed with chivalry.
And that's when the backlash began, the reactionary phase. When these traditional, rigid roles came under legitimate threat, the old guard, the people who wanted to conserve that historical order, they reacted. And they reacted strongly.
And the source identifies this powerful reaction as the birth of the monster.
The monster being toxic masculinity in its modern form.
Yes. Instead of adapting to this new reality of individual capability and equality, they doubled down. They started putting more emphasis on the conditioning that reinforced the old, rigid behaviors.
The message became even louder.
Much louder. If society was starting to say, you don't have to be the protector, the reaction from the old guard was, no, you must be the protector, and if you fail at that, you are nothing.
So the conditioning became harsher, less forgiving, more absolute.
And this desperation is where the dynamic shifted dangerously toward violence. Think about it. If before, a man's word was law, and his authority in the home or community went unquestioned, now that authority was being openly challenged by his wife, by his children, by the legal system.
He felt he had to prove his masculinity, to prove his strength and his command, because it was no longer just being handed to him.
And that proving, in the absence of societal support for the old structure, often led to the use of force.
So violence became the tool to enforce a failing, collapsing authority structure.
Yes, the use of physical or emotional violence became the mechanism. This is likely when the true monsters of masculinity, the overtly abusive, controlling, and harmful expressions we recognize today, really began to emerge in force.
So toxic masculinity, in its most destructive form, is a psychological reaction. It's a desperate, often violent defense mechanism against the threat of true equality and individuality.
It's crucial to understand that. The violence wasn't the original rule. It was the reaction to the rule being questioned. It's the sound of an old, brittle identity crumbling under pressure.
It's the panic of someone whose entire sense of self is tied to a role that the world no longer recognizes as universally necessary or superior.
And this brings us to what the source calls the sad part of the story, the unfinished equality.
What does it mean by that?
While women have successfully, though the fight is far from over, challenged and changed the system, the general idea of equality of opportunity is largely accepted now. Men have, in a way, been left behind.
There's a massive masculine gap.
A huge one. There has not been a similar organized mainstream movement that gives men the opportunity and the permission to let go of these old beliefs in a supportive, structural way.
So men continue to be educated, formally and informally, to maintain that role of protector, to value strength, endurance, and command above all else.
Even though the modern world they live in demands partnership, flexibility, and emotional vulnerability.
They're trapped in a profound double bind.
They really are. The cultural code, the old programming tells them, never show weakness, provide everything, be the unquestioned authority. But the modern world, their partners, their jobs tell them, you must be emotionally available, you must share leadership equally, and if you use force to get your way, you are a criminal.
They're being asked to navigate a 21st century relationship with essentially 10,000-year-old programming.
And they often lack the tools or even the social permission to process the grief, the anxiety, the shame that comes with failing to meet these impossible, contradictory standards.
The provider anxiety alone must be immense, that internal pressure to be the primary earner, regardless of a partner's income or capability.
It stems directly from that ancient protector role. It becomes a core source of self-worth that is constantly under threat in an equal society.
Now, before we explore the path forward, we have to reiterate that crucial distinction the source mandates.
Yes. Understanding this historical cause does not excuse or exempt any man from responsibility for his actions, especially for violence or harmful behavior.
Never. Context is not a free pass.
The individual is always responsible for their choices. But understanding the architecture of the trap, why these destructive actions can feel instinctual or justified to some, is the only way we can effectively provide men with the necessary tools to choose a better path.
We treat the disease by understanding its origin. The unfairness of the modern challenge is just so clear. Men are held to ancient standards in a modern world that actively rejects those very standards, and this often leaves them isolated, confused, and deeply ashamed. Which brings us to our third reflexive question. Have you ever felt that internal pressure to act tough or hide your pain simply because you feared the consequences of challenging the accepted way a man should behave? Maybe the consequence was rejection by a partner, ridicule from your friends, or just that internal feeling of being less of a man. Try to identify the specific fear that drove that repression.
Okay, so we've tracked the history right up to the present day. Now we have to analyze the mechanism that keeps this whole outdated system running. And that mechanism is the pervasive use of shame.
Shame is society's most effective enforcement tool. It's that constant, subtle, and sometimes not so subtle pressure that reinforces that old, battle-forged identity.
And the source identifies a very common delivery vehicle for this shaming, and it often comes from the very people who might claim to oppose toxic masculinity.
It's those doubly offensive expressions. The classic example is, you cry like a little girl.
Let's pull that phrase apart because it's a compound psychological weapon. It does two very destructive things at the same time.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, it insults the man by implying that showing a normal human emotion crying strips away his status as a man. You're demoted. Your gender card is revoked for a moment.
And the second offensive part.
Second, it deeply insults the feminine by using little girl as the ultimate benchmark for emotional weakness and inferiority. It uses the feminine as the object of scorn.
So it's not just don't be emotional, it's don't be emotional, because being emotional is feminine, and being feminine is a lower status.
That's it. It is the ultimate statement of gender exclusion and hierarchy, all packed into 5 little words.
And the consequences of this kind of shaming are just dire. Men are conditioned to seek this emotional rigidity, but the reality is that emotional freedom is what leads to stability.
The source argues, quite convincingly, that women often lead a more stable emotional life because they have the social freedom to express sadness, fear, or vulnerability openly.
They have an emotional release valve.
A crucial one that men are socially conditioned to cap off, to seal shut. But repression doesn't equal strength. It just means the pressure builds up internally, and it has to go somewhere.
And it inevitably bursts out, often as anger or violence or addiction.
Exactly. That freedom to process emotions as they come actually makes women, in this specific aspect, emotionally stronger and more resilient.
So, based on everything we've talked about, we need a clear working definition of toxic masculinity today. It's not just a collection of bad behaviors.
No, it's a systemic problem. The source suggests toxic masculinity is the result of 3 specific factors converging and trapping the individual man.
Okay, what's factor 1?
Factor 1. Ideas that initially made sense for survival but are now completely outdated, like that warrior's code of absolute emotional silence we discussed. These ideas, rooted in crisis necessity, are still being passed down.
Okay, so outdated ideas. What's factor 2?
Teaching methods that have not been modified and continue to impart those outdated ideas. This is the institutional problem. It's the father, the coach, the cultural media that constantly, relentlessly reinforces rigidity and strength above all else.
And factor 3?
And factor 3 is maybe the most cynical part. It's the groups who actively benefit from these old ideas remaining in force.
Who are these groups?
It includes men who seek power and control, who rely on that traditional hierarchy for their dominance. But the source also points out that it can include opportunistic women who leverage those old cultural clauses.
How so?
By demanding the benefits of chivalry or the financial security of the provider role without accepting the necessary equality and shared responsibility that comes with the modern world.
So this definition makes it clear that toxic masculinity is a feedback loop. It's a systemic problem maintained by a mix of self-interest and outdated programming, and it involves all genders and institutions. It's not just men being bad.
Right. And the source really emphasizes the real immediate challenge this creates for the individual man today. The apparent lack of healthy, defined alternatives for exercising his masculinity. The old models persist because the new ones feel vague or undefined.
Let's talk about those old models, those obsolete operating systems. The source mentions a few: the macho man, the strong man, the Don Juan, the lone wolf. Why do these models cause so many crashes today?
Well, let's take the strongman model. It fails because it equates competence with emotional suppression, which means when real stress hits a job loss, a health crisis, the system overloads and you see catastrophic mental health failures. There's no release valve.
What about the Don Juan?
The Don Juan model fails because its entire basis is superficial validation and control over others. This leads to a profound, deep isolation and a total inability to form the lasting, vulnerable emotional bonds that humans need to thrive.
And the lone wolf, the rugged individualist.
The lone wolf fails because modern life, from our jobs to our families, requires teamwork, collaboration, and vulnerability. Those are qualities that are completely antithetical to the isolated, self-reliant myth.
So these models are obsolete. They're designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore, and they lead to unhappiness and self-sabotage.
Which means the solution has to be focused on seeking an identity that's more centered on one's true self.
The authentic internal identity that exists outside of that rigid protector role.
Exactly. The goal is to convince men of the tangible benefits of abandoning these old, broken stereotypes. And the main benefit is genuine, lasting self-worth and real emotional stability.
But to get there, we have to confront a difficult truth that we've kind of alluded to throughout this whole conversation.
That we are all perpetuators.
Yeah. This is about taking collective responsibility, even if we are, ourselves, victims of the stigma.
The first step is just recognition. Recognizing that this stigma is an inherited, shared problem is the absolutely crucial first step toward dismantling it. We have to move beyond just blaming men or just victimizing them.
Let's get really specific about the behaviors we need to stop enabling.
Okay, think of mothers who repress their sons crying, telling them to man up or be a big boy.
Or fathers who demand an excessive level of physical toughness, punishing their sons for showing pain from minor injuries.
Think of partners who, maybe unconsciously, expect an invulnerable, financially bulletproof provider and then express disappointment or even contempt when their partner shows vulnerability or needs support.
And then there's the broader society that punishes masculine sensitivity. The mockery directed at men who enjoy traditionally feminine activities, or who express nuanced emotions beyond just anger or happiness.
Every single one of those acts, big or small, reinforces that rigid, centuries-old trap. The burden of change is collective. We all have to stop reinforcing the outdated programming in our homes, with our friends, and in our communities.
And this brings us to the final and maybe the most important step, the path to becoming a complete human being.
The source states that real lasting change begins when we, as a culture, stop associating fundamental human qualities, empathy, vulnerability, emotional expression, exclusively with the feminine.
We need a linguistic and cultural overhaul.
We do. These are not feminine qualities or male qualities. We must recognize that these qualities are universal. They are an integral part of any complete, healthy human being, regardless of their gender.
Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the capacity for true emotional connection.
Empathy is not softness. It is a critical leadership skill in any field.
And sadness is not failure. It is a necessary and healthy process of dealing with loss.
The goal, then, is integration. It's about making these ingrained patterns visible, like we've tried to do today, and questioning them. That is the beginning of the path.
A path toward a society where being a man doesn't require wearing that heavy, rigid, battle-forged emotional armor that limits both the person wearing it and everyone around them.
That armor might have protected the primitive tribe, but today it only serves to isolate the modern individual from himself and from others.
So questioning these patterns in yourself and in others is the most powerful act you, the listener, can take right now. It's the beginning of true self-awareness and emotional freedom.
And that leads to our final reflexive question. What is one emotion? It could be vulnerability, or fear, or sadness that you have been conditioned to hide. And what would it look like if you allowed yourself the freedom to express it openly to a trusted person, maybe even today? Just imagine the relief and the genuine connection that single act might unlock. #tag outro.
We have completed a pretty massive journey today. We traced the masculine stigma all the way from its primitive origins, those biological differences that were refined into survival instincts during the cognitive revolution.
We saw how those rigid battle rules spread into civilian life, poisoning core cultural concepts like chivalry with these hidden premises of inferiority. And we saw how the pressure of individualism in the 20th century triggered a violent reactionary masculinity, the toxic monster.
And finally, we identified the modern trap, the constant use of shame, and the necessary path forward, recognizing that all fundamental human qualities are simply universal, not gendered. The key to freedom is seeking an identity centered on your true self, not on an outdated warrior code.
Now that you understand the why behind all these pressures, you have the power to consciously choose a different, healthier identity. You know the history, you know the programming, and you know the mechanism of the trap. And that knowledge, that's the first real step to freedom.
Don't simply take our word. Put everything you heard here to the test. Make this knowledge truly yours.
Remember, the power is yours.